Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our weekly press briefing. As usual, we have Alexandre Juniac, our Director General and Chief Executive Officer, with us. He'll be making some remarks and we'll be open to questions after that. But just to get us started, I'd like to call on Brian Pearce, who's our Chief Economist, and he has some analysis of April traffic to give us sort of a context for today's press briefing. So, Brian, can I call on you, please?
You can. Hello, everybody. We have the data in for April air travel, and that's going to be the focus of this presentation, because the industry hit unprecedented lows in April. April really marked the month that the airline industry stopped flying. These lines here show that global RPKs, air travel, was down 94.3% compared to a year earlier. Capacity, ASKs, were down 87%. Load factors overall were just over 36%, 36.6%, all new record lows. We've obviously never seen this before. Just to note that a year ago we were noting record highs for all of those metrics, so an extraordinary turnaround. There has still been some domestic travel, and I would emphasize that we're looking here at the passenger business. The cargo business presents a rather different picture, and certainly there's quite a bit of flying taking place on freighters and some converted passenger aircraft to support the world's need to transport cargo. But in terms of international passenger flights, they essentially came to a halt in April, as you can see here, except for a few repatriation flights. There's virtually no international air transport for passengers in the month of April. RPKs internationally were down 98.4%, capacity down 95.1%, and load factors even lower, the global total at 27.5%. The only exception to this unprecedentedly low figure is the Chinese domestic market, which, as you can see here, which shows RPKs, has been recovering from its February lows when RPKs for the Chinese domestic market were down 83.6%. And it's improved further through April this year. At this point in April, the Chinese market was 66.6% down on a year earlier. Obviously, still down a long way, a slow recovery, but considerably better than the February low. And load factors in the Chinese market have risen to 66.4%. But as you can see from the other two lines, in other domestic markets, excluding China and internationally, there was very little, if any, air travel during the month of April. I think the sort of final point I'd like to make about April is that, not surprisingly, load factors in all regions fell to all-time lows this April. As you can see, these lines show the range that we've seen over the years in April, and also note that this time last year we were noting all-time highs. At the industry level this time last year we had an 83.1% load factor. It's fallen this April to an all-time low of 36.6%. And as you can see, for all of the regions, it's down at all-time lows. Again, the exception is China's domestic market, where, having hit a low in February, we've actually seen load factors climbing back up the scale to that 66.6% number that you can see there at the bottom. What's not clear at the moment is whether that load factor is above break even for the Chinese airlines. So that's the situation in April. The industry's hit all-time lows in the passenger business, virtually no flying taking place at all internationally in April. And indeed, if you look at worldwide flights, these include cargo flights. So you can see that there is some flying taking place to support businesses and medical supplies by the cargo business. But these flights are dominated by passenger flights. And you can see that the low point was hit around about the 21st of April. And we've just seen those April numbers showing that low point in the passenger business. What I would note from this is that during the month of May, we've actually seen a pickup. And it actually is a 30% pickup from that low point. But obviously that's 30% on a very low number. We're still something like 73% lower than January the 1st in terms of worldwide flights. But it suggests quite strongly, I think, that May was a better month than April for the passenger business globally. So certainly at the moment, it looks as though April will mark the low point in this cycle. And I just want to cover a few more points, which I think reinforce the idea that we have seen some improvement in the air travel and the passenger business during May. I think the first point to note is that businesses in a number of the major economies around the world have actually become more confident than they were at the low points of the crisis. We've already seen that in China, where we've seen a recovery in business confidence from the February lows. The last few months have seen businesses, particularly in the manufacturing sector in China, much more confident than they had been in the past. And that's typically associated with economic growth. We've also seen rather later improvements, but as lockdowns start to end, as the economies in other countries like the US, like Germany, like Japan, begin to return to work, we have seen a rebound in confidence. Clearly, still fairly low, but beyond that turning point again, and we think suggesting that April marked the low point in this cycle. So moving sort of more closely into the airline business, what's happening there? Well, what we're seeing, certainly in domestic markets, is that airlines are seeking to stimulate the market, seeking to encourage passengers back onto domestic air travel by cutting fares. We've earlier seen the experience in the Chinese market where actually domestic fares came down about 40% to help with relatively slow, but nonetheless a rise in air travel in the Chinese domestic market. This shows the global average for domestic fares, and certainly according to the bookings data that we have for May, the average fare for domestic air travel was down something like 23% compared to where it was last year. So airlines are, as we said in an earlier presentation, as we expected, airlines need cash because of the crisis, and they're seeking to encourage passengers onto seats by offering low fares. The challenge, of course, will be that unit costs will have been increased by a number of the restrictions that have been put in place. And we're seeing the results here in a number of domestic markets in Asia, because this is where the lockdowns and the travel restriction relaxations have started. In April, we saw the Chinese market recovering. You can see that the recovery or the rise from the low point in China began at the end of February. Actually, the South Korean domestic market also began to rise at the end of March during April, but it's a much smaller market. It really had no noticeable effect. what I think I would note is that we've subsequently seen in May the Vietnamese domestic market and more recently the New Zealand domestic market recovering as lockdowns ended, and actually, as you can see, at a rather faster pace than we saw in China and South Korea. So some significant increases. So 3 of those markets are more or less within 20, sort of 25% down on where they were a year ago in 2019, and that's from a point where many of those markets were down 80%, some even almost fully closed. So a significant improvement in those markets. That's domestic travel. We've still seen very little international travel, but I think these headlines taken from a variety of media indicates that things are starting to happen. In our briefing on the IATA restart plan, we talked about a number of phases in the move from shutdown back to more normal conditions, the phases, starting with domestic markets opening. We saw that in the previous slide. The second phase we expected were bilateral agreements before more wider continent-wide or multilateral agreements. And that is what we're starting to see with, for example, I think it began with the discussions between Australia and New Zealand with the Trans-Tasman bubble to accept passengers flying between New Zealand and Australia. And we're most recently, I think, seeing its discussion in the UK with the notion of air bridges. The UK has obviously imposed quarantines on inbound passengers, but there's a lot of discussion because we know that will mean virtually no travel. And we're seeing lots of discussions at the moment, I think, between the UK and Portugal at the moment about setting up an air bridge between countries with relatively low risk of importing COVID-19. So I think there is in sight. We are starting to see the relaxation of restrictions, and interest is growing amongst consumers. These 2 lines here show searches, so they show Google searches. The blue line shows Google searches for COVID-19 articles. As you can see, that peaked in mid-March and has since been on the decline. It peaked in mid-March, and at that point it exceeded searches for air travel. Obviously, at that point we saw the closure of many borders outside of China. In the last week, we've seen for the first time since that point searches for air travel rise above searches on Google for COVID-19, and they're about 25% higher than where they were at the low point in April. Again, that 25% is 25% on a very low base. They're still 60% down on where they were in January. So this is still a relatively small and slow improvement. But nonetheless, I think it shows a significant growth of interest amongst consumers, intention amongst consumers for air travel. And then the final slide is looking at the bookings data evidence on whether we saw an improvement in May from those April data that showed the industry hitting new lows in April. And I think this shows that from the bookings data that there is an increase in bookings for air travel. One of the things that we've seen, and you'll see that in the cutout box, there's been a change in passenger behaviour in booking. So back this time last year, the March to May period last year, we saw people booked, more than half the people that were booking booked more than 3 days in advance, whereas so there were only 46% last year that booked to travel 0 to 3 days ahead of their travel date. But that number has risen to 61% this year. This is for the Chinese domestic market. So consumers, passengers are booking much, much later than they would have done. So we're not seeing the bookings in the forward bookings data that we had done in the past. And I think the chart there shows the comparison between last year. This shows, in this case, for global bookings. It shows bookings for the month of May, the travel month of May. Last year, there were plenty of bookings in the previous 2 months. Bookings were essentially flat up until early May this year in 2020. But throughout the month of May, we have seen a steady rise of bookings, albeit still at a fairly low level. But I think it's another piece of evidence that May will be a better month and off the low that we've seen in April, albeit not by very much at this stage. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Brian. We will now turn to Alexandre to give us a few remarks before we take questions. I do see some people are posting questions, so that's great. Just a reminder, if you do post questions or do you have questions to ask, please do them in the chat function. So with that, Alexandre, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone. A very short comments. I would like to underline a couple of positive developments that happened in the last days. The first is the discussion of air bridges, or what is also called travel bubbles. We see this concept being discussed in various parts of the world, and the idea is to establish connectivity among regions with similarly low rates of infection. As a temporary restart measure, we support the discussion if it opens borders to at least some traffic more quickly than would otherwise happen. The second positive development is the publication of Takeoff, which is the report made by the ICAO's COVID-19 Aviation Recovery Task Force, which is known as CART. Takeoff is a comprehensive series of guidelines for mitigating the risk of transmission across the air travel experience of passengers and aviation workers. And I cannot overstate the importance of the Takeoff guidance. It's a global way forward for aviation. The recommendations take into consideration the expertise of regulators, but also the World Health Organization and those in the business, airport, airlines, manufacturers, etc. So it's a very comprehensive and consistent document that should be applicable and implemented everywhere in the world. These recommendations have been put together in a record time, and we must congratulate ICAO for that and all the organizations that were involved. The implementation is the key point for these guidelines, and we see some urgency for government to include them in their at least regulation or recommendation or measures that they would implement to reopen borders. And of course, it will contribute to restore passenger confidence. The key point there is to implement these guidelines in a harmonized way. So we'll have an harmonized approach and a similar process of health control, sanitary check for passengers everywhere. So it's a key element for a coordinated and effective and efficient restart of air travel. So that is what I wanted to comment on. Thank you for your attention, and we welcome your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexandre. So we've got a few questions in the queue. We'll take them in order. The first question is about Europe. It says, we're seeing some European airlines, mainly the low-cost carriers, announcing fairly bullish capacity plans, up to taking their operations up to 60% of the usual for the third quarter of this year. What's your view on where demand will be by then? And do you see it coming back that fast, or what are the factors that would impact that? And I guess the last part of the question is China really the model that we would expect Europe to follow?
Brian, you want to take it?
Yeah, let me start with the first part anyway. We're expecting to see, I think, a relatively slow recovery compared to previous cycles. Having said that, there's a lot of pent up demand, obviously because of this extraordinary situation. So I think really the speed of recovery, the speed of improvement in the third quarter, depends in a large extent how quickly governments relax travel restrictions and relax lockdowns on people. I think clearly there is demand for travel. We've seen the increasing interest, and just because of the circumstances, we believe there's pent up demand there. So a lot of this will depend on the speed with which governments are able to agree and hopefully follow the processes that have just been announced by ICAO in order to open those markets and to allow that pent up demand to come.
Okay. Alexandre, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I have nothing to add. I think it's not surprising that we see quite a bullish program for the low cost, because we anticipate that the appetite for travel, especially for personal reasons, VFR, tourism, etc., are still there. So it's not surprising to see that in Europe.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about IATA's auditing programs. And I guess generally the question would be, what is IATA doing to support airlines and other operators in maintaining their IOSA and their ISSA certificates given the COVID impact? And as the question comes from Africa, the second part of that would be, is IATA doing anything specifically to support African carriers in this respect?
Now, for the IOSA and ISSA audit and certification, what we have done is we have extended the limits for some IOSA audits or some ISSA audits, or to allow this audit to be properly performed after the limit date and within a period of some months that is, of course, compatible with the safety requirements. It has been done openly, transparently, and with in complete transparency with ICAO, and it allows airlines to maintain their certification and and of course the airworthiness of the aircraft, the licenses of their personnel, to ensure that they will be able to fly safely, even if the initial date for the audit and the certification has been delayed. But everything is absolutely under control and under the scrutiny of our teams, of the regulators, and so we have done everything to adapt the system to take into account, the exceptional conditions of COVID-19, without, of course, any compromise on safety. And we have done nothing particular on that point for Africa these measures have been taken on a worldwide basis. And Africa has been among the continents in which this type of measures have been taken as well.
Great, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question for Brian. You proposed, or you showed a slide with some domestic reductions in ticket prices. The question is, do we see a similar pattern in Europe, or do we have any breakdown of that by region?
It's early days yet. We've seen the domestic markets opening in Asia, and so we've got some history, a couple of months of experience there. We saw the Chinese airlines discounting to try to stimulate demand. We don't have that visibility in Europe as yet, but I would expect a similar pattern. But the challenge is going to be to make the economics work, because particularly if airlines are being required to keep middle seats empty, and certainly the new processes will reduce aircraft utilization because of slower turnaround times. Airlines can be faced with much higher unit costs, and obviously lower fares and higher costs don't go well together. So I would expect to see the market stimulation to be, a relatively short-term feature of the markets. I think once we see economies and consumers and travel demand rising more significantly, there are going to have to be, the higher costs are going to have to be recovered in some way. I think we've just lost Tony for a moment. I'm sure he'll be back in a second.
Yeah. Sorry, here I am. Yes, so the question is, on those searches, the question reflects back on Google searches. And the question is, do we have any data as to what the searches were about? Were they people looking on trips that they had made earlier? Are they trying to book new trips? What exactly were they looking for, Brian?
So these were searches looking at air travel generally. So it's certainly possible to more closely define those. And indeed, IATA has a service called IATA Air Travel Pulse, which certainly looks at where these searches are taking place. But I'm afraid I don't have any information here about exactly what those searches were. But I think the fact that we are seeing some increased interest in air travel, whatever the aspects of that are, suggests some renewal in consumer interest for air travel as markets begin to open up.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about the U.S. market, also for Brian. Do you have any data on the changes in booking patterns for the U.S. market in particular? In other words, are Americans booking travel closer to their travel dates?
Yes. I don't have the numbers specifically for the US here, but we do. We have seen this pattern of consumers waiting for longer before they book to travel in markets outside of the Chinese domestic market. I think this is I guess it's not unsurprising, but I think it's partly because of the uncertainty that consumers have at the moment. So it's meaning that there's less of visibility that we and airlines have about the strength of demand in future months, which is going to make it even more of a challenge for airlines as they move into this restart period with demand that's rising but still fairly low. There's lots of capacity around. Costs are going to be higher, and airlines are going to have a lot of debt. It is going to be quite a difficult time for airlines in this early stage of restart.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question from Africa, and the preface says that while we've been asking for governments to bail out airlines, in many cases governments themselves may need a bailout. So how confident is IATA that African governments will have the financial means to support the industry there? And do we have any indication of the political will amongst African governments to do so?
There is a strong political will among African governments. The problem is more, the financial resource of some states that do not always have enough money to bail out the airlines or even more generally the travel sector. So what we did in conjunction with other organizations, the African Airline Association, the UNWTO, the WTTC, that we have written to financial agencies such as the African Bank of Development, the Islamic Bank of Development, many bilateral development agencies, the World Bank, to put together a financial stimulus plan to help either the industry or more likely the states in Africa for them to be able to engage at a financial support plan and to have enough resources. And in these financial packages, to devote a part of it for the airline industry. And we have had a pretty open attitude coming from international financial institutions such as the African Bank of Development or some international agencies. And already the African Bank of Development has announced a $10 billion plan, and we expect additional funds coming to help either the states or directly the sector.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have a question about cargo. Yesterday, IATA announced its April cargo figures showing that there's a capacity crunch, and that is affecting or impacting the price of transportation. How have freight rates changed compared to last year? And if they are more expensive, what impact might that have on, for example, the performance of the e-commerce sector?
Let me just comment on that. I think the e-commerce has been one of the strong, successful sectors during this whole crisis. Accentuating the trend that we've seen, this shift towards e-commerce, and air transport is critical to get goods to consumers fairly rapidly. So that's been an important component. I don't think that will change. What we certainly have seen is that because half of the capacity for carrying air cargo, which is normally in the belly holds of passenger aircraft, were grounded, suddenly the remaining capacity on freighters faced in excess of demand. Although traffic was down 27.7% in terms of cargo ton kilometres in April compared to a year ago, there was a much larger fall in capacity of 42%. Load factors rose more than 11 percentage points to 58% in April. So there was a real shortage of capacity. So not surprisingly, cargo rates went up very significantly on a number of markets, reflecting that supply shortage. Now, what we've seen in more recent weeks is that those rates have started to fall off because airlines have been busy converting passenger aircraft in order to carry cargo. and so that is starting to ease a little the capacity shortage. I don't think it's going to damage the long-term prospects for e-commerce at all. And I think this is really the rate increase is probably a temporary feature of this capacity shortage. And as the passenger fleet comes back, as markets open, we'll see that ease.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a two-part question. The first part, which has already been responded to, so I'll just go to the second. And the second is saying, do we expect a reduction in air travel if there's a second wave of COVID-19? Or do we expect that the measures that are being put in place by countries will ensure safety and help to buoy the industry through a potential second wave?
Well, let me comment just very briefly on that before turning it to you, Alexandre. I mean, obviously, we can't rule out a second wave of COVID. So that's, obviously lots of uncertainties. We're saying in this release that we think April was the low point. I think we got reasonably good evidence suggests that there was an improvement in May. But we obviously don't know exactly how the virus will behave. But Alexandre, I don't know whether you've got any comments that you'd like to make.
No additional comments. As you said, we can't rule out a potential second wave. But we think that the measures that are in place should allow air travel to continue. In addition, you must know that the CART report and the CART guidelines, they are adaptative. So it's not a fixed set of measures, intangible. They can be modified, upgraded, changed, taking into account the feedback that we will have on the implementation of the initial guidelines or the evolution of technology. For instance, all the testing for COVID-19 system, and so they might be adapted to a new situation created either by potential second wave or by the complete disappearance of the virus if it happens. So it is something that has been designed to be implemented now and adapted to the future situation.
Yeah, Alexandre, I suppose there's also an element of predictability because of the risk framework that's included in the guidelines?
Yeah, of course. Yes, there is an element. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Latin America. It says that the Brazilian government has reduced its financial support from 10 billion reals to 4 billion. How do you see this action? And is it enough to support the industry through this difficult time?
You mean the 4 billion support plan in Latin America?
In Brazil specifically. So the government reduced it, according to the questioner, the government reduced it from 10 billion to 4 billion.
It is clear that in Brazil, the action of the government is significant, and they are doing a pretty supportive policy for airlines. It's not the case everywhere in Latin America, in which we see that some very well-known and old airlines are in trouble, sometimes under the Chapter 11 equivalent. And that it's a region in which I think the government effort is still needed. We are considering that Latin America government should do more for their airlines. But Brazil have done a pretty good job on that respect.
Okay. We have a question on the length it might take to see the industry recovering to pre-COVID-19 levels and travel patterns? Do we expect that's going to be months or years? And what will the length of time it takes to recover have on the long-term global connectivity and labor mobility?
Yes, I mean, there's clearly a risk here with the industry being grounded with very fragile finances. There's certainly a risk that the connections between cities will be much less than before, and that's critical for the wider economy, for businesses, because those are the connections along which trade and investment and tourism flows. So I think it is really important that the industry is supported and that we do see these connections re-established. I think domestically, certainly as you saw in those earlier charts, the experience of Vietnam, of Korea, actually, we're seeing flights back to quite quickly, back to within sort of 25% of 2019 levels. I think domestic markets are likely to recover to 2019 levels sooner. If the economic forecasters are right, the global economy will be back to 2019 levels sometime next year. We think it'll probably take a year longer for domestic air travel to get back to where it was. Internationally, though, we would expect a rather slower process of several years, and that's really sort of dependent on the speed with which borders opened up. As we've seen and discussed, we're seeing at the moment just bilateral discussions with travel bridges, travel bubbles. What we obviously need is a more multilateral relaxation of measures, and that will take time.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have a question about passenger behavior. Specifically, are people more concerned about travel restrictions and quarantines than they are about health and safety when they're considering travel?
The question is, are the passengers more concerned by quarantine than
yes, than actually catching the virus perhaps while traveling?
It's difficult to say that they are more or less concerned. They are very concerned by quarantine, and it's a major obstacle to restore or to restart air travel. But nobody can plan, a 2 or 3 week travel anywhere, spending 2 weeks in quarantine. So it's a major obstacle, and it creates an enormous uncertainty for passengers. And the reason why we are saying to government to avoid these quarantine measures, especially if the sanitary and health control guidelines that have been published through the card are put in place, because it minimizes the risk of transmission not only on board but from one country to another.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about airline business models. Are some business models proving more resilient to this crisis than others, or less resilient, I suppose?
Well, I don't know if you want to take it, but from my point of view, there is no rule. Yeah, it was more dependent on the financial situation of each airline before the crisis, or just at the beginning of the crisis, than from a specific business model. The airlines that were financially strong, with a strong balance sheet and a strong profitability, have been less severely hit than the weakest.
Yes, I agree with what Alexandre has said. I mean, this health crisis has hit every airline and indeed every business in the economy, whether they had strong business models or not. I suppose one differentiating factor, as Alexandre's mentioned, is those with very strong balance sheets and substantial access to liquidity have not all needed the support of governments. I guess there will be a challenge to business models as we enter the restart period, with the combination that we're starting to see of low fares, but increased costs of operations. It's going to be the ones with the strongest business models and indeed balance sheets, because with the levels of debt that we drew attention to last week, that's going to be a financial challenge. Airlines are going to have the working capital and access to the liquidity to finance their operations in the early stages of the restart.
Thank you, Brian. We have a question about China. What types of measures has China put in as they've emerged from their COVID-19 crisis? Because that's happened before ICAO published its recommendations. And how closely do they match what ICAO has recently released?
China has supported entirely the CART report. So so there is no ambiguity about that. That on some elements of very technical, China could add or could modify some technical elements. It is possible, but they have been fully supportive of the work and the guidelines issued by CART. So it should be minimal, and the experience of the Chinese measures have been very useful for those who have drafted the CART report, because it was probably the most advanced area in the world in terms of restarting aviation, considering that they were first to be hit and first to control the pandemic, and then first to start or to restart the airline industry. So.
Okay, thank you. We have another question on the ICAO recommendations. In the past, the industry has not been so successful in seeing recommendations put in place during a crisis, like after 9/11 or with the ban on liquids and gels. They've stayed with us for a very long time. How confident are we that PPE, social distancing, and other types of measures being put in place now will be retracted as the situation evolves?
In the key principles that have directed the work done by ICAO, by CART, the fact that these measures have to be implemented fast and should be removed when they are not necessary is one of the key principles, and I think that it's an important point. It's an important point that all governments have strongly supported, and the industry as well. These measures are necessary. They are implemented. They are not anymore necessary. They should be removed.
Okay, thank you. Another question on the guidelines. How is ICAO and IATA, or how are ICAO and IATA communicating the takeoff guidelines across the broader stakeholders in the industry, for example, the business travel communities, in order to strengthen their confidence and trust?
What we will do is advocate strongly in favor of the implementation of these measures. So talking to every government in the planet, and especially the 20 key states where we have identified to implement these measures as fast as possible. Secondly, we will ask our members to implement these measures very, very fast and to lead by example. And we will, of course, act through the industry and with our industry partners, whether it's airports, NSPs, ground handlers, the travel and tourism industry, to implement and to deploy these measures when they can contribute. And so we'll do everything with everybody to accelerate the implementation of these measures.
Okay. We have a question about our forecasts. I guess the premise of the question would be, are the green shoots that we started to see with the increase in travel in April and in May in line with our previous thinking about how long it would take to recover from the crisis?
Yes, I think they are. I mean, we certainly didn't expect to see anything taking place earlier than this. I mean, in some ways, we had been prepared for a slightly longer lockdown during the second quarter, but there's talk of a number of international markets opening up in June. So we are looking for a third quarter start for some international markets. I guess that what we have seen is a slightly earlier improvement in some domestic markets than we had thought, in New Zealand, in Vietnam, but they're relatively small. So in practice, they won't affect the numbers. So, I think the forecasts that we